Fourth lecture on democracy and social conflict, how we govern ourselves between elections. Last week, in exploring the pragmatism of John Dewey.
Kevin, I'm sorry. Okay, you can. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Last week, in exploring the pragmatism of John Dewey, we saw that despite an original and powerful philosophy, Dewey met with both difficulty and misunderstanding during his lifetime in communicating his distinctive vision. Why was it so different? And why was it so difficult to explain? Now, a term that Dewey often used for his philosophical method was empirical naturalism. This referred to what he saw as both the method and the success of natural science in drawing on human experience for its insights and conclusions. This followed the approach of earlier pragmatists, including William James, who called his own similar method radical empiricism. Both men sought to extend the methods of science to values and ethics, which meant openness to all forms of human experience, not just physical objects studied in the laboratory. We might not ask a chemist to study ethics in a test tube. But is there such a thing as an ethical scientist? What would that be? One kind of ethical scientist might be someone who looks carefully around the world for evidence of ethical problems, just like natural scientists begin with natural problems and the need for concern and therapeutic attention. We looked at the recent novel by Miko Kawakami titled Heaven, whose subject is the brutal and violent bullying of two middle school children. You might say that Kawakami, like many other novelists, is a type of ethical scientist. She is pointing to dramatic evidence of a serious ethical issue. She is defining a problem. By her intense portrayal of a practice that is clearly intolerable and unacceptable to her readers, she is not unlike the astronomer who discovers evidence of an expanding universe, or a microbiologist who seeks out the cause and cure for a serious illness. Kawakami is the young Japanese novelist who became interested at an early age in philosophy and has used it in her challenging work. Pragmatism is a philosophy of problems, and her new novel is an exercise in defining a problem more than its solution. The history of science is also one in which defining the problem has been critical to addressing it. That can take time and experience. The young children in her novel have no defense against bullying. They seek to understand their suffering through philosophy, and they turn to Friedrich Nietzsche, whom many consider the great prophet of moral relativism. Kawakami then shines light on the relation of conduct to language and thought. She raises a general philosophical question about bullying. Are we stuck with it? And must we follow Nietzsche, the philosopher of power, and accept it? I said last time that Dewey's transformative continuum speaks to the situation in Kawakami's novel and fills an important gap in the conventional idea of relativism. It does so in a way that is unique to philosophy. Kawakami portrays how debilitating the lack of moral certainty can be, especially at age 14. But what about the very process that we are studying, the stages of moral inquiry, and the social nature of uncertainty? The social continuum of inquiry raises larger questions than just democracy and self-government. It raises questions of philosophy, and especially of moral relativism. Relativism comes from a logic of indeterminacy, a static, analytical logic, where pragmatism prefers a logic of uncertainty, a dynamic and developing logic. Other 20th century philosophers failed to grasp Dewey's vision and even accused him of actually fostering relativism by ignoring moral absolutes. This was an enormous and tragic misunderstanding of Dewey's thought. How could it have occurred? I sought to address that through the work of another philosopher, Alasdair MacIntyre, who perhaps uniquely understood what Dewey was concerned with. MacIntyre's diagnosis is simple. A static analytical logic has captured Western moral philosophy and blinded it to what is really going on. MacIntyre is one of the great living critics of analytical philosophy. It blossomed in the 20th century. At the opening of his book, After Virtue, published in 1981, MacIntyre imagines a society that has destroyed the memory of its scientific culture, the historical sources of scientific knowledge. It is hard to imagine this truly happening, but MacIntyre has a different point. Could this have happened to morality? MacIntyre suggests yes, that if we look at the history of ethical thought, something similar to that has happened. MacIntyre's histories of ethical theory in several books are now classics. His 1966 Short History of Ethics, a history of moral philosophy from the Homeric age to the 20th century, is required reading for anyone interested in the subject. MacIntyre is not a neutral observer. He takes Aristotle as his model and combines Aristotle with Thomas Aquinas. He is not quite in the pragmatist camp, but there are elements of his approach which help us to understand John Dewey. Like many other contemporary philosophers, MacIntyre does not fully appreciate Dewey's contribution, but his dynamic vision of the continuum of inquiry. But that does not lessen the importance of his criticism of analytical theory. MacIntyre's reason for that imaginary scenario, which we talked about last time, was to show how morals and ethics have lost their connection with reality in a way that is remarkably parallel to the situation John Dewey sought to communicate and to address. MacIntyre supplies a reason for the difficulty in seeing that contemporary language is hiding the problems. He describes a long continuum of philosophical inquiry that has been derailed by failure. And he says that because philosophy is itself responsible, it is blind to its own derailment. The meanings of moral terms may seem clear, but only in a sense that is out of touch with what is most important. So language itself has lost an adequate connection with reality in the sense of a dynamic and radically changing reality. And we are utterly at sea, as the expression goes, in an uncertainty that looks like indeterminacy. The connection of language and reality may become lost, even though it may once have existed. Then it can infect a whole society, such that people cannot agree on matters of moral truth. MacIntyre says that the root of this is because we have all fallen under the spell of emotivism, which is, quote, and I quote, the doctrine that all evaluative judgments, and more specifically all moral judgments, are nothing but expressions of preference, expressions of attitude or feeling, end quote. Emotivism comes from the fact-value dichotomy that I mentioned last week, that values are not facts. MacIntyre said, quote, one objection to the view of the imaginary world which I constructed, let alone to my view of the real world, is that the inhabitants of the imaginary world reached a point where they no longer realized the nature of the catastrophe which they had suffered. He implies that the loss of connection between experience and morality is the true catastrophe of our time. When claims about moral value are reduced to mere emotion, they are thereby stripped of the status given to our statements about right and wrong. The resulting moral relativism undercuts our ability to agree on the premises for moral debate, as well as to collectively imagine and enact solutions to moral problems. Worse, it leads to moral absolutism, a form of bullying that Dewey himself experienced from his critics like Mortimer Adler, who said that Dewey left Western civilization bereft of the absolute values it needed to resist Nazi Germany. Until we apply experience to the terrain of ethics, said Dewey, the door is open to this sort of bullying. Quote, you're a relativist, end quote. If you confine reality to physical objects, you leave values in the realm of pure feeling. This is the issue of the fact-value dichotomy, a long-standing commitment of analytical philosophy. And MacIntyre diagnoses this. We might say he is another kind of ethical scientist. For clarity last week, I called this factual narrowness. It says values are not real facts. If values aren't really real, there's no way to apply science or scientific inquiry to values and ethics. But this is asking the wrong question. The right one is whether values properly draw on human experience. And if so, how best to put that insight to work? Dewey criticized factual narrowness for its repudiation of a role for scientific method in ethical judgment. And it left the door open to the other means of settling moral questions, which was with the bullying, which I talked about. And he said, quote, "This is the problem which we are compelled to face if we ask whether human behavior is capable of being directed by other means, like superior force, external authority, or sheer emotional outbursts, not controlled by authenticated ideas." That's his technical language for saying it's the only ethical science is required to avoid bullying as a moral relativist. We explored this last week when we took a detailed look at legal problems, or the week before last, and how they are resolved through successive judgments. It is not that different from seeing science as a process of resolving a physical problem by successive experiments. This should help us to understand Dewey better than his contemporaries did when he tried to explain its importance. In examining this, let's turn to Dewey's own failure of communication and look at where Dewey's philosophy had arrived by mid-20th century. Here, we encounter the problem of meanings, of terms like truth, the real, and even science, longtime concerns of philosophy. All three came under the powerful influence of analytical thinking. First, how about truth? Dewey had risen in the last century to prominence among Western intellectuals, but he struggled to make an impact on the leading lines of philosophical thought. Notably, he had defined truth as, quote, warranted assertion, unquote. This was a very controversial move, but it makes sense when you understand the importance of Dewey's dynamic vision of his continuum of inquiry. Recall what we said about the nature of both scientific and legal knowledge earlier. Drawing on Nancy Cartwright, we compared it to a dappled world with areas of stability and instability, of certainty and uncertainty. Dewey's use of the term warranted assertion suggests the constant necessity of further inquiry. The term truth sounds certain and final, and that's what analytical philosophy preferred. Its meaning is what philosophers often call apodictic. This doesn't mean we are throwing the word truth under the bus. Warranted assertion drew from Charles Peirce, the 19th century father of pragmatism, whose idea of truth was the ultimate end of inquiry. Inquiry always begins with doubt. Truth is the ultimate conclusion of an unlimited community of inquirers, of a progress from doubt to belief, universal belief. This is the famous doubt-belief formula, signifying truth as the purpose and goal of extended continuous inquiry. Dewey's empirical naturalism collided in the 20th century with the exploding influence of analytical philosophy, in which formal logic, mathematics, and linguistic analysis took prominence among academic philosophers. The leading English analytical philosopher, the great Bertrand Russell, ridiculed Dewey, calling his theory of truth, quote, the satisfaction of personal desire. Russell concluded that Dewey's conception of truth as warranted assertion was like taking a generalized wishful thinking as a definition of truth. Now, Dewey's response to that was, and I'll quote it, quote, Mr. Russell proceeds first by converting a doubtful situation into a personal doubt, although the difference between the two things has repeatedly been pointed out by me. A personal doubt is pathological unless it is a reflection of a situation which is problematic. The desire that enters is a desire to resolve as honestly and impartially as possible the problem involved in the situation. Okay. This was not a powerful response. Dewey here draws an important distinction between a doubtful situation and a personal doubt, but he fails to emphasize, in this instance, a critical aspect of the doubtful situation, its social nature. That includes the very social uncertainty that we have examined from the first. Dewey's continuum of inquiry is social in referring to the situation, but he leaves out the problem raised by social uncertainty, dispute, and conflict. He appears to imply that the situation, that a smoother, more consensual progress is possible in the situation, not the agonistic process that so often requires passage through disagreement. Dewey implies that resolution can be achieved through society acting almost like a unitary mind, as an omniscient we. Now, Dewey's early thought was heavily influenced by biology. He would say such things as that unless his critics accepted his biological, anthropological method of approach to experience, debate would be interminable. This organic model, drawing from biology and evolution, obscured the role of dispute in knowledge. You might say Dewey discounted Darwin's struggle for survival. This brings us right back to Kenneth Arrow and the old problem of fixed preferences. If new knowledge requires new conduct as well as new language, how can that be achieved in a consensual inquiry? It's a complex question that we will address in some detail as we go along. Another issue that was raised by analytical philosophy was the nature of reality, realism, or what is real. Dewey was engaged with theorists of science like Hans Reichenbach, a leading logical positivist and a famous theorist of science. Reichenbach was troubled by Dewey's unwillingness to admit that only scientific objects could be said to be really real. Reichenbach opposed the reality of mere appearances in Dewey's conception of what he called, quote, known relations between things and tertiary qualities and dreams as real aspects of primary experience, end quote. The term positivism got confused by this very debate, as Dewey considered positivism of science to be open to values, while positivists like Reichenbach were fact value separatists, clinging to an emotivist metaphysics. Mortimer Adler, in condemning Dewey's positivism, had failed to see that Dewey was altogether a different kind of positivist from Reichenbach, who rendered it largely irrelevant to judgments of value and relegated all moral affairs, personal and social, to the status of private desires. We can see here that the meanings of these critical terms, like truth and reality, are subject to transformation through experience. The same can be said of the meaning of science. For Nancy Cartwright, the world of science is not hierarchical as presented in a textbook, but the reality is dappled in a way that we find for all social knowledge of both science and law. When you see a successful space expedition with a landing on the moon or travel to a distant planet in the universe, you can assume that everything is hierarchical. That there's a pyramid of knowledge leading to that event. But the reality is that there were many different trials and errors before that happened, that science came, that this achievement came out of dappled rather than uniform and wholly consistent knowledge. Because knowledge is not a fixed mirror reflecting a fixed reality, but more like an ocean with some areas of calmness or stability and other areas of swirling, disruptive uncertainty. A moon landing comes from areas of calmness and stability. But those uncertain areas may in fact be in the process of becoming stable and calm. The great question is how. The conceptual world of pragmatism is distinct from traditional models. For example, how might it relate to artificial intelligence? Some experts on AI seem to think that computerized robots could somehow take over and not only run everything, they could dominate humans with their superior intelligence. But think about that. Could the robots find their way through social uncertainty? If that means finding new conduct, new habits, and new language that does not exist yet. They all have to be programmed. And even if they could program themselves, they would have to use existing language and existing forms of human intelligence and conduct. Ask yourself how computerized robots would be able to find their way out of Alistair McIntyre's imaginary world, which is not just a world of data, it's also a world of morality. Many experts assume that AI, artificial intelligence, can simulate or replace human forms of knowledge. If interaction and conflict are part of the formation of new knowledge, how, we might ask, would that be replicated by programmable devices, no matter how sophisticated? Even in their predictive role, they would be drawing on current knowledge and practice, already tested in the real world. How can any device or set of devices, made now or later, discern their way through uncertainty and disagreement? Dispute is resolvable only through new beliefs, new patterns of conduct, and new moral language, through a new ethical world. Pragmatism defies computerization. It escapes the assumption of an imaginary, universal, spectator mind, seeing the world like a camera. In rejecting a single objective viewpoint, it recognizes the necessity of interaction, dispute, and group conflict. It's an account of multiple interactions with the gradual formation of their resulting beliefs. Social conflict is an essential aspect of the actual operation of this model of knowledge. This is different from the individual mind. You yourself might go through conflicts to make your own individual judgments about the world. Those conflicts are largely hidden by your mind when you reach a conclusion. Not so with society, where conflicts are out in the open. The computer conception of the human world, the AI conception, suffers from assumptions that I can best describe as mechanical and linear. A problem appears, the software and the app is created, and the problem is eventually solved. Even if it is enormously complicated, giving rise to much trial and error, the mechanical and linear process is assumed. With enough time and effort, we can get there. Even disagreements are resolved by running the software. The distortions of social media are seen as a distraction, not part of the natural process. But distortions are part of the actual, natural human world. Real social conflict is much more complicated, and we have only begun to analyze it. Using studies of the common law and its history, drawing on the work of Holmes and Edward Levy, we can begin to trace the process of resolving ongoing conflicts as they find their way into habits and precedents. We can see that precedents then conflict when lawyers try to apply them to new problems. And every problem is unique. The dappled world of law, its model or vision of society, is one of nodes of stability surrounded by emergent new problems challenging us in new ways. A legal precedent, such as a simple traffic rule regarding right-of-way, is the result of prior instances of traffic accidents and injuries. What is a right? A legal right begins life as a practical solution. If the solution is put into practice, and if it succeeds, it can gain legal sanction. However, new situations may arise in which new forms of injury occur. They often draw on unrelated practices that may also be supported by law. Where diverse precedents conflict, they must be resolved. A new problem has arisen. At first, difficult problems go through a stage of uncertainty. Cases arise that have no clear classification under existing law. They appear to lie in between opposing practices, laws, or legal precedents. So the real world is one of constant battles over similarity and classification. Similarity is a mixed function of description, conduct, and habit. Once a dispute is settled into stable belief, we have deduction from it. Everywhere else, we have a mixture. We might call it induction and abduction, Charles Peirce's word for hypothesis, for creative intelligence. In this model of reality, you get a different definition of democracy. It has to do with the inclusiveness of the process of defining problems and the creative process of resolving them. It's ironic that with so many difficult and uncertain problems, economic, social, cultural, and medical, as we have today in Brazil and the United States, that we are surrounded by extreme national polarization. This dualism between left and right is actually an escape from real problematic uncertainty, an escape into ideological certainty. Instead of recognizing the detailed sources of uncertainty, people on both sides of the polarization are seeking comfort that will prove ephemeral. Everything we know about the history of social conflict suggests that this is intrinsic to the process. Like us today, Dewey struggled in defining the leading conceptions of political theory, especially capitalism and socialism. In advocating his conception of democracy as community, he sought to frame a different world of democratic life, extending to public education and the world of organized labor, but he was criticized as naive. One influential philosopher, Reinhold Niebuhr, claimed that Dewey was unrealistic about human nature in his famous book, in Niebuhr's famous book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. He attacked Dewey's optimism, saying that Dewey envisioned that the egotism of individuals is progressively checked by the development of rationality, end quote. Niebuhr said Dewey's belief in the inevitable triumph of human intelligence lacked appreciation of predatory self-interest, and it attributed social conservatism to ignorance. He had therefore failed to understand what Niebuhr called the brutal character of behavior and the power of self-interest and collective egoism in all intergroup relations, end quote. Policy is determined by what Niebuhr called the proportion of power each group possesses, at least as much as by any rational or moral appraisal of the claims of each group. So here was a leading progressive intellectual almost accepting the philosophy of Nietzsche. I bring this up because Dewey was either naive about problem solving or he hadn't thought it through. But I also think that Dewey had a more realistic side. He knew conflict. He was surrounded by it. And he greatly admired a true expert on conflict, Justice Holmes. Holmes was a Civil War veteran, wounded 3 times, and he saw violent conflict as a symptom, a breakdown of social conflict in general. If Holmes and Dewey could have spent more time together, just as I said about Frank Knight and Edward Levy, Dewey might have answered Niebuhr's criticism more effectively. I'm actually bringing these two together, Dewey and Holmes, in my theory of democracy and social conflict, the view that I'm proposing in these lectures. Liberalism was another disputed term, as it still is today. Dewey identified with many liberal causes. The conservative scholar, Lewis Mumford, attacked his pragmatic liberalism in a diatribe titled The Corruption of Liberalism, as preoccupied with the machinery of life. He said Dewey was preoccupied with the machinery of life. Conservatism has tended to emphasize such things as values and ideals, metaphysical absolutism, bringing ultimate first principles to things like law and education. But as Holmes often said, for every actual dispute, there's at least 2 opposing first principles. We will get to that point in a later lecture. The only type of human character that Dewey could understand, said Lewis Mumford, was the utilitarian type, believing that the emotional and spiritual life of a man needs no other foundation than utility and the rational utilitarian activities associated with the getting of a living. Remember that we have been analyzing the radical difference between classical static utilitarianism and Dewey's dynamic continuum of inquiry. We will take a look at how Dewey and Holmes together could have worked out an alternative vision. Utilitarianism had been a long dominant philosophy, but Dewey never addressed it head on. Instead, he had to defend against a challenge from self-styled democratic realists. After World War I, political scientists produced studies that served to undermine the ideals of participatory democracy. Calling themselves democratic realists, they questioned the capacity of the average citizen for rational political action. Intelligence tests were given to a wide range of citizens, and especially by the US Army. They suggested limitations of rational capacity. These democratic realists then argued that the role of the public in decision-making should be restricted and power should be placed in the hands of the few who, by their standards, were rational and intelligent. The president of the American Political Science Association declared, quote, "The dogma of universal suffrage must give way to a system of educational and other tests which will exclude the ignorant, the uninformed, and the antisocial elements. We must admit, as did Aristotle, that an aristocratic as well as a democratic element is necessary in government," end quote. Dewey's notion of organic democracy grew from his resistance to this tendency to turn to experts as better qualified to govern than the citizenry. Government was seen by these democratic realists as too complex to be turned over to the common will through the ballot alone. Experts would be required to actually control the levers of power. Consider the implications of this view. It implies that plenary public power flows from the electoral process. This conception of power affects everything. It is only possible to have such power directed by economists, social scientists, and others of the educated elite. Recall what Friedrich Hayek said about legislation. He doubted that it would be possible to control everything through rational constructivism. His implication was that it would be dangerous to try. But democratic realism was held by many influential intellectuals, notably Walter Lippmann, with whom Dewey had several famous debates. Lippmann was a journalist and theorist with broad experience of war and internal conflict, and he became the leading critic of democratic institutions. Having served as a journalist in World War I, he knew how distortion for propaganda purposes could find its way into the newspapers. How much worse today is the prospect of distortion in digital social media? The realities of public life, the major important issues and problems, could simply not be made to stand out, to be clear amidst all of the self-centered sources of opinion. The real common interest would elude public opinion entirely, and so could only be managed by a specialist class whose personal interests reach beyond those local interests. Lippmann was a progressive and certainly had his own agenda of common interest. But he assumed himself to be such an elite specialist with personal interests reaching beyond his own. We have lately had experience with this issue, with widespread resentment of elites controlling political decisions. Today's rejection of elite rule only reinforces the drift toward authoritarianism and still creates worldwide resentment of elites in all existing political systems. Dewey's organic democracy was a response to Lippman. His answer to democratic realism came in the form of his next book, The Public and Its Problems. The chief weakness of the realist argument, Dewey said, was that its indictment was against the machinery of democracy, not the public itself. With the growth of industrial capitalism, there was a new public, said Dewey, not yet organized, still developing, but it was being ignored by an outmoded political system. Experts could not represent these new interests. The task of democratic reformers, like Dewey, was to discover the means by which this new public could reorganize itself to define and express its interests. For Dewey, this was a problem of inquiry and communication. It required the perfection of means of communication and of shared interests. Here, I think Dewey's model of the path of social inquiry and reform actually suffered from the very same linear assumptions I discussed earlier. If the problem was one of reorganization, then first, he says, you diagnose the problems correctly. Next, after defining the problems, you define the solution. And then third, implement the correct reforms. Industrial capitalism needs to reorganize itself. It has to define itself and its interests, and then it can gain leverage and effectuate its goals. But how could these many new and diverse interests be inclusively represented? Dewey's answer was simplistic and abstract. Democracy, he said, will succeed when free social inquiry is wedded to the art of full communication. So Dewey counted on a politics of knowledge that would address the bewilderment of the public. But this politics remained at best an implicit and undeveloped element of his argument. It would somehow maximize agencies of direct democracy through which the public would choose to govern itself. But many questions were left unanswered, like the interdependence of local communities on the national one, and an interaction between many different groups who are at odds with each other. But Dewey never returned systematically to this problem. So rejection of Dewey's faith became a standard feature of a dominant strain of liberal democratic ideology since early in the 20th century. Many liberal theorists still regard his ideal as hopelessly utopian and even potentially threatening to social stability. But if it is nothing more than a competitive struggle for the people's vote, it narrows democracy to little more than an ex post facto check on the power of elites. If it remains a choice among a limited range of aspirants to office, it's really a shifting oligarchy. That's what Niebuhr said. Quote, there is such a constant shift in the oligarchy, both in the political and economic sphere, that the oligarchy is kept fluid, so fluid that the concept of a single elite does not really apply. In the last years of his life, Dewey was a radical Democrat on the defensive. He was widely honored and broadly ignored. Philosophy was dominated by abstract questions of truth and the real. Dewey called this the epistemology industry. Philosophy's primary aim was knowledge of a fundamental and ultimate reality, not the actual reality of human problems and purposes. Democracy's greatest power was as a moral ideal. Democratic choice is more than an immediate utilitarian decision. as Arrow assumed. It involves a transformation of conduct and habit, as well as of the actual problems themselves. We saw that Kenneth Arrow's vision of social preferences is a simple, elegant, and abstract structure. It attributes a static mathematical uniformity to the actual and changing diversity of preferences. Hayek's vision also imposes an abstraction, the idea of spontaneous order, somehow imposing real order and control over the chaos of human problems. We need to understand reality in greater detail, the reality of conflict resolution as a process. As we get into this, it may sound a bit technical, but I'll try to make it clear, especially by comparing it to utilitarianism. Now, the process involves what I call normative induction, how the discovery of new knowledge and new ethics compares to the rigid model of utilitarian theory. To explain it, I'll advance three themes. First, new moral knowledge is generated in conflict of conduct as well as opinion. Second, this often requires extension in both time and space, the extension of time within society. Ethical inquiry is a product of broad experience throughout society and often requires considerable time to reach stability. Finally, third, this is because it requires transformation of conduct as well as discourse and persuasion if serious conflicts are to be fully resolved at all. Another important thing is the role of habit. Dewey addressed this in his response to critics. Habit change is obviously a key issue. It comes through conflict, but the conflict must address the reality of the problem. Thus, the underlying problems must be recognized, opened up. I think that is what Kawakami does in her novel Heaven, with its focus on both bullying and relativism. There is a new kind of moral challenge that she depicts, the challenge of bringing real problems to the forefront. Utilitarianism still dominates conventional moral and political theory. In addressing it, we will see that the young Oliver Wendell Holmes is the father of normative induction. His contribution, not just to utilitarian theory, but to legal and ethical logic, is original, outside the analytical canon that has so long dominated moral theory. Even as he returned home from the American Civil War, utilitarian theory in England was being refined through the works of John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick. We'll get to them later. Holmes's attitude toward its vision, his own vision of conflict, had been affected by the war. This influenced his dynamic view of legal utility, rather than the static view, the mirror or flash camera view. Utility itself is in constant dispute and transformation. Dispute resolution for Holmes was fundamentally precarious and required a new logic of contingency and experiment. These insights were drawn by Holmes from legal history, which served as a factual, empirical context for understanding normative inquiry into what should be done. The very nature of utility is constantly disputed in everyday life, and disputes must generally be resolved for civil society to survive. Holmes developed his overall perspective in the years immediately following the American Civil War, and the specter of that conflict, with different views of utility, hangs over it. Utilitarians acknowledge that utility may be disputed, but ultimately they assume that conflicts can and must be commensurated through a utilitarian calculus. It's originally a counting of aggregate pleasure and pain. You balance the pleasure against the pain, and that equals the answer, whatever comes out. Sound familiar? That's exactly the vision of Kenneth Arrow. The idea of omniscient measurement has always been problematic. From the lack of anything like a purely speculative omniscient measurer. How do you measure this? Yet actual normative life is replete with constantly changing standards of measurement. Measurement of utility must and does indeed take place. The challenge is understanding how. As I want to demonstrate, the context of calculation, the environment of normative reasons, is not static. And along with transformation of normative practice comes transformation of meanings, defining expected utility. Opposing views or expectations of utility are not reconciled. They're not reconciled by constantly tallying and balancing, but by and through adaptation with the adjustment of habits and practices. So you see that the classic utilitarian model is like a balance of weights, whereas the real adjustment of utility is through adaptation of those fixed preferences. Society does not always work out conflict through an uber legislative calculus imposed by a hypothetical utilitarian fiat, but often and perhaps mostly by redefining or replacing the terms and forms of calculation in disputed, problematic contexts. How does civilization survive constant conflict? It requires the retirement of incommensurable reasons, not the forcing of choices among them. And this is precisely what Kenneth Arrow fails to recognize in his general impossibility theorem of 1951. Our fate depends on the piecemeal transformation of what might be called the reasons environment. Doing so with particular controversial moral questions, like take for example medical assisted death. Medical assisted death, as you know, is the question of euthanasia for patients with extreme pain and extreme illness. And it first came up way back in 1999. Many of you may not remember, there was a doctor by the name of Jack Kevorkian who invented a device whereby a patient in extreme pain who wanted to commit suicide could push a button and through the device would effectively end their own life. And Kevorkian tried to make this completely autonomous for the patient, but nevertheless, he was prosecuted for homicide and convicted and sent to jail. So you started out in the end of the last century with a problem of medical assisted death. But since that time, you don't have the same limited choice between prosecution or suicide, between autonomy, personal autonomy, or the right to life, even though those two moral absolutes are still surrounding the debate, the right to personal privacy and the right to life. Nevertheless, this problem has developed into a series of new understanding, new questions, the identification and application of detailed practical issues like improved medical technology, living wills, and ultimately local legislation. So other examples of subtle transformations in legal conflict are rife. And we will get to them later on. And in the next lecture, I will begin to describe how conflict resolution applies to such things as medical assisted death or other problems. So the chimes are ringing, and that is the end of my presentation for today. And I look forward to seeing you all in 1 week.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your beautiful pronunciation.
You're welcome. I'll see you in a week.
Okay. Ok. Meus alunos, nós estamos muito impressionados com a qualidade dessas conferências. Vocês devem estar avaliando. Como sempre, vocês irão receber uma síntese das mesmas. O professor Pedro está se encarregando disso. E nós estamos hoje concluindo a quarta sessão, a quarta conferência, e estaremos de volta na segunda-feira, nesse mesmo horário, para nos deliciarmos com as belas concepções e reflexões do professor Keller. Muito obrigado e bom dia a todos.